He stood still as ordered. His duty was to remain silent, not to react to anything. But something in the behavior of the child, who was being held by the shoulder by a grown man, made him tense. Just one tiny gesture, and everything he had been taught for years suddenly became unimportant. This moment changed fates. What did the guard actually see? And why did he go against centuries of protocol right outside the palace? Enjoy the story. At the very heart of London, beneath the imposing stone facade of Buckingham Palace, an air of regal serenity enveloped the ceremonial grounds. It was early morning, and the crisp light of dawn filtered through the historic architecture, lending a golden hue to the meticulously maintained lawns. Tourists thronged the perimeter of the palace, their voices hushed in reverence as they captured every moment on their cameras. Amid the orderly procession of guards performing the time-honored changing of the guard ceremony, the atmosphere was one of disciplined precision and unruffled tradition. Among the stoic ranks of the royal guards stood Staff Sergeant Roderick Vale, a veteran of the guard whose career spanned decades of unwavering service, strict discipline, and an almost legendary attention to detail. Vale's uniform was immaculate. Every button gleamed under the early sunlight, and his polished boots clicked in precise rhythm upon the cobblestones as he stood at his post. His steely gaze, the product of countless hours of training and experience, missed nothing. Though his expression was as solemn as the ancient monuments that surrounded him, a deep sense of responsibility and honor radiated from his every pore. He had witnessed many ceremonies, spectacles marked by pageantry and tradition, yet he had always regarded them as more than mere rituals. They were solemn reminders of the nation's storied history and its enduring values. On this particular morning, however, a subtle disruption began to disturb the comfort of routine. Near the edge of the crowd, beneath the watchful eyes of the palace's sentinels, a man appeared, moving almost inconspicuously among the well-dressed onlookers. He wore a simple dark coat, and his hands were deep in the pockets of his tailored trousers. Clutched in his arms, as if out of sync with the surrounding formality, was a little girl. She was small, no more than 5 years old, with pale, wide eyes that seemed to reflect a world of uncertainty. Unlike the other children who might be fidgeting with excitement at the splendor of the ceremony, she was strangely silent, her gaze distant and her posture stiff, as though she were carrying a weight far beyond her years. Staff Sergeant Vale's seasoned eyes, trained to detect even the slightest deviation from protocol, caught the peculiar air about the child. In a split second, as he scanned the faces of the assembled onlookers and the pages of the unfolding ceremony, something in the girl's detached demeanor set his instincts ablaze. There was no visible panic in the crowd. The majestic cadence of the ceremony continued unabated, the guard's precise movements slicing through the morning calm. Yet the little girl did not seem to belong. She did not smile for the cameras, nor did she join in the quiet awe shared by the others. Instead, her gaze remained fixed, almost as if she were waiting for something or someone. Roderick Vale's mind raced back to the countless hours of training imbued in every member of the Royal Guard. They were taught to observe not only for overt disruptions, but also for those subtle signs that might hint at hidden dangers. He recalled drills where even the slightest anomaly in behavior, a twitch of the eye or a silent plea hidden in an innocent gesture, could signal a need for urgent intervention. In that moment, the child's stillness and the faintly troubled look behind her eyes resonated with an internal alarm that he had learned never to ignore. As Vale's gaze lingered on the pair, he noted the man's furtive glances toward the guards as he navigated the throng of tourists. His face was obscured by shadows and an air of resigned detachment, and his grip on the child was tight in an almost possessive manner. There was an undercurrent in his behavior that did not match the composed cadence of the palace grounds. It was as though he was desperately trying to remain inconspicuous, while simultaneously burdened by an undeniable urgency. Every fiber of Sergeant Vale's being tensed with professional intuition. The orderly beauty of the ceremony stood in stark contrast to the silent distress embodied by the little girl. Though the ambient chatter of the visitors and the disciplined cadence of the guards' footsteps filled the background, Vale's focus narrowed to the pair at the edge of the gathering. He wondered, was this merely an innocent family visiting the palace, or did a darker reality lurk behind those somber eyes? There was no sound, no distress signal audible to the crowd, only the quiet language of gestures and glances that spoke in muted warnings. Even as the formal proceedings continued, with the crisp orders of the commanding officers and the meticulous arrangement of the guards' formation, Sergeant Roderick Vale felt the weight of a decision forming within him. He knew that to question the order of the ceremony would be unorthodox, perhaps even a breach of protocol, yet the silent plea he perceived in that child's posture was unmistakable. In that moment, the pristine veneer of tradition was about to be challenged by the raw human cry for help that only a truly vigilant heart could discern. Deep in thought, Vale let his eyes wander one more time over the little girl's face, a face that was as enigmatic as it was sorrowful, and he silently vowed that he would not allow the familiar cadence of duty to blind him to the subtle signals of danger and distress. A storm was silently gathering beneath the calm exterior of that grand ceremonial morning, and for Sergeant Vale, the first stirrings of that storm marked the beginning of a chain of events that would soon change lives forever. In the midst of an otherwise flawless ceremony, as the imperial routine unfolded with clockwork precision and the crowd marveled at the majestic display of formality, an almost imperceptible change in the air brought with it an ominous note of distress. Just as the measured drumbeats of the guard and the hushed awe of the onlookers melded into an atmosphere of revered tranquility, a tiny disruption manifested in the form of a subtle gesture, a silent, almost unseen plea for help that would upend the strict order of tradition. Standing near the edge of the gathering, the little girl cradled in the arms of the somber man, her face remained unreadable amid the ambient smiles of tourists. For all outward appearances, she might have been yet another child visiting the palace, caught up in the wonder of the ceremony. But her behavior was markedly different. While her peers would naturally fidget or gaze in amazement at the regal splendor, this child exhibited a deliberate stillness. Her dark eyes darted toward an unseen horizon of worry. Then, in a moment that lasted barely a blink, she performed a gesture so slight it could have been mistaken for the loosening of a small fist. In that instant, she bent her wrist ever so slightly and squeezed her index finger against her palm in a precise, deliberate pattern. This was no random movement. It was the internationally recognized sign for SOS, a silent call for aid, taught to vulnerable children in situations of danger. At that very moment, Staff Sergeant Roderick Vale, whose steely gaze had been surveying the ceremonial fields for any trivial breach of decorum, found himself suddenly transfixed. Although his posture and his routine had always been adhered to without deviation, his deep-seated instincts, honed over decades of devoted service, flared to life as he recognized the hidden language of distress in the little girl's subtle movement. In his mind, a tidal wave of memories flooded back. Long, rigorous hours of training where instructors emphasized that the smallest, seemingly insignificant gesture could scream louder than any shouted cry if it signified peril. He recalled exactly how a similar pattern, taught to children in vulnerable situations across the globe, was a codified emergency signal when words might fail. In that split second, Sergeant Vale experienced an internal conflict of profound intensity. He was acutely aware that the guard's protocol demanded unwavering adherence to routine. Every step, every command was designed to maintain the sanctity and the order of the ceremony. Yet here was disguised by the hum of the crowd and the formality of the event, a heartfelt cry for help that transcended all protocol. Duty, he thought, has always been the backbone of our service. But what is duty if it ignores the call of a child in distress? His valor was not only in the precision of his actions during a ceremony, but in the quiet strength to defy an inflexible system when human life and safety were at stake. He struggled with the gravity of his decision. On one side lay the chain of command and the unwavering mandate to maintain order at all costs, a rule so sacrosanct that deviation was punishable with scorn and severe reprimand. On the other side, his own conscience screamed for him to act decisively upon detecting the distress signal. The sergeant's thoughts raced. He recalled with visceral clarity the lessons drilled into him during his early training days. The critical importance of subtle cues, the necessity to trust one's learned instincts when conventional instruction fell short. That undeniable gesture, executed by a fragile-looking child, carried with it the unmistakable clarity of an SOS. The sergeant's eyes narrowed as he studied the scene. The man holding the child wore an expression that was shrouded in somber detachment, his attempts at blending into the throng almost too perfect for comfort. Yet, in that man's furtive glances and his unusually tight grip on the child, there lay an imperceptible, yet unmistakable, anxiety. Every nerve in Vale's body rang with the decision that needed to be made. He must act despite the risk of breaching the strict protocols of the Royal Guard. He knew deep within that to stand idly by might mean condemning an innocent to an unknown fate. Resolute, Sergeant Vale fought against the constraints of duty encoded in his every training session. He felt the pulse in his ears as he weighed the consequences. A single act of defiance here could jeopardize his career, disrupt the ceremony, and even draw the ire of his superiors. Yet his duty to preserve life and protect the vulnerable urged him forward. Without a moment's hesitation, his heart pounding in his chest like a rallying drum, he turned away from his stationary post. As though propelled by a force greater than protocol itself, he advanced toward the man and the little girl. Every step he took seemed to echo like a clarion call of rebellion against cold, measured regulation. With each determined stride, Sergeant Vale recalled the significance of the training he once received. A lesson underscoring that sometimes the most crucial orders are whispered by one's conscience, rather than barked by an officer. In that decisive moment, he chose to honor his humanity above rigid diktats. He swiftly moved through the pool of mesmerized tourists until he reached the pair. "Madam," he addressed in a low, urgent voice that carried only the weight of genuine concern. "Please, come with me." His words, though measured, carried an unmistakable urgency, a gentle yet firm invitation to step away from an unfolding crisis. The sergeant knew well the possible repercussions of such an unsanctioned move, but understood that acting in silence was a luxury he could not afford when faced with a simple, albeit desperate gesture pleading for help. The ceremony's orchestrated elegance was now punctured by the murmur of confused onlookers. The once harmonious cadence of the guard's formation was interrupted by questions and startled hips parting to allow the sergeant his path. Yet in that overwhelming moment of chaos, there was a clarity that no one else in the crowd could fathom, the clear, unyielding clarity of a heart committed to saving a life. The sacred rituals of the palace paled in importance when measured against the life and safety of an innocent child. As Valentine's resolve solidified, the sergeant's mind raced with the possible outcomes. Would his actions be met with derision? Would his superiors condemn him for the breach of protocol? Perhaps, in another corner of his illustrious career, he might be remembered as the officer who allowed protocol to win over humanity. But now, with the little girl's silent cry echoing around him, these possibilities vanished into insignificance. The decision was clear. One must always look with the heart when duty clashes with conscience. In that brief and poignant moment, a delicate pause in the pulse of tradition, a single gesture had ignited a chain reaction that promised to upend the ordinary. Sergeant Roderick Vale, with the weight of his years and the fire of his conviction, stepped forward to challenge the status quo. His actions, daring and possibly unorthodox, were not merely a breach of ceremony. They would soon form the first link in a chain of events that would expose a dark undercurrent of desperation and ultimately secure the safety of a child whose silent plea had spoken louder than any command. In an instant, the meticulously choreographed rhythm of the ceremony was shattered. As the murmurs of astonished onlookers rippled through the crowd, Staff Sergeant Roderick Vale, his face set in grim determination, stepped forward with unwavering resolve. His authoritative stride cut through the disciplined formation of royal guards, arresting the attention of everyone present. Heads turned, and the hushed awe that had defined the morning's proceedings now gave way to a disbelieving silence. Vale reached the pair, a nervous man clutching a small, silent girl who appeared fragile amidst the grandeur of Buckingham Palace. With his eyes fixed on the man, he leaned in and spoke in a low, controlled tone that resonated with genuine concern. "Is that your daughter?" The question, simple in its phrasing yet loaded with urgency, electrified the air. For an eternity, the world around him seemed to stand still as the man's face contorted with anxiety. His eyes widened in panic. He fumbled with his words, clearly unprepared to be confronted in such a public setting. The man's voice trembled as he began to mutter an explanation, his gaze darting around as though searching for an escape from the inevitable spotlight. A collective gasp rose from the surrounding tourists and palace staff alike. Cameras, which had been capturing the ceremonious pageantry of the day, now zoomed in on this unexpected interruption. The regal ambience that had once underscored the event was replaced by a tense, anticipatory energy. Whispers fluttered among the onlookers, speculating about the unfolding drama. Had a child been neglected or abducted? Was this an isolated incident of familial distress? Or did it hide something far more sinister beneath the polished veneer of tradition? For a moment, the man tried to slip away, his body tense with the urgency of escape. His eyes betrayed a fear that ran deeper than simple apprehension, an instinct that whispered danger in a language that even the most refined protocols could not translate. Despite his attempts to retreat into the anonymity of the crowd, Sergeant Vale's presence loomed large. His unyielding posture spoke volumes. In that stern look, any doubts about the legitimacy of the distress signal were dispelled. He had not come for a casual inquiry. He was a guardian of duty and compassion, and he recognized that moments like these could not be ignored. Before the man could make another move, a ripple of action surged through the area. The palace's orderly facade began to crumble as security personnel emerged from behind the discreet barriers that lined the royal grounds. Their uniforms, bearing the marks of tradition and authority, glinted sharply as the morning light as they converged on the scene. The sudden appearance of these figures served as an implicit reminder that the sanctity of the ceremony was at risk of being breached by force, if necessary. Yet even as the security team approached, Vale's resolve did not waver. He maintained his steadfast focus on the pair, his eyes piercing through the man's feigned composure. As palace security edged closer, the tension escalated further. Every step, every hushed caution from the guards was underscored by the fact that protocol had been irreparably broken. Royal ceremonies were a ballet of precision and unyielding order. To see a member of the guard step off his post to engage with a visitor, especially in such a charged moment, was almost unprecedented. The routine was being upended, because a single, silent gesture, a child's carefully executed SOS signal, had spoken louder than the strict dictates of the established system. From a distance, Vale's colleagues and other guards exchanged anxious glances. Some moved to intercept him, their expressions conflicted between obedience and an instinctive understanding that sometimes a higher duty was at play. But Vale's voice cut through the murmurs decisively as he repeated his inquiry with extra authority. "Please, step aside. I need to speak with you now." His tone brooked no argument, and it was clear that he intended to defy the rigid schedule of the ceremony if it meant safeguarding the child. The man's nervous demeanor deepened further under the combined glare of the approaching guards and the sergeant's unwavering stare. He shifted his weight, his knuckles whitening around the straps of his coat, as if the very act of holding the child was too heavy a burden to bear in public. The silent protest of the child, a subtle tightening of her small fingers, became a stark counterpoint to the man's escalating anxiety. It was a moment imbued with both quiet desperation and the stark reality of a distress call that could not wait. In that fraught atmosphere, as palace security and protocol clashed with the imperatives of human compassion, the world seemed to hold its breath. Tourists, who had come intending to witness a traditional ceremony, now found themselves unwillingly cast into the heart of a drama that transcended etiquette, a drama where the smallest signals could dictate actions that surpassed the bounds of established order. Staff Sergeant Roderick Vale, standing almost alone in his defiance of protocol, had irrevocably made his choice. By deciding to intervene, he had set into motion events that would soon disrupt centuries of tradition and force the hardened bastions of ceremony to face the uncompromising demands of humanity. In that suspended moment, as the man hesitated and the palace security advanced, the fate of this fragile child hung in the balance, a delicate life that depended on the courage of one man willing to risk everything for the sake of a silent, anonymous cry for help. In the charged aftermath of Sergeant Vale's bold intervention, the atmosphere around Buckingham Palace shifted from confused astonishment to simmering urgency. The little girl, once caught in a moment of silent distress, now began to cry softly. Her fragile sobs, barely audible at first, gradually broke through the heavy hush that had fallen over the gathering. In those heartbreaking sounds, it became clear to those nearby that she was not merely a bystander to an unusual incident. She was a frightened child, yearning for safety. The man's already nervous posture worsened as the child's tears spoke volumes. Her distress was no longer masked by stoic silence, but now unmistakably pleaded for help. As panic edged into the murmurs around the guards, a few observant tourists pulled out their smartphones to record every moment. It wasn't long before one of them recognized something eerily familiar in the child's features. Through whispered conversations and hurried glances between onlookers, word spread that a missing American child, missing from New Jersey just 2 weeks prior, had been circulating in news reports and social media. The realization struck like a bolt. This little girl was not where she was supposed to be. The gravity of the situation quickly rippled through the crowd, and even the rigid facade of palace formality began to crumble under the weight of the emerging crisis. Within minutes, the call to the local police was made by an officer stationed nearby, who was alerted by the escalating tension and the reports made via mobile messages. Sirens soon punctuated the afternoon calm. As uniformed officers arrived on the scene, their presence, swift and authoritative, signaled that this was no longer an issue of ceremonial disruption or a minor family matter. It had transformed into a fully fledged investigation. Officers carefully cordoned off the area near the palace entrance, and the rapid pace of events left little room for explanation. As the investigating officers began asking questions, they turned their attention to the distressed man clutching the child. The initial inquiry was simple. "What is your relation to this child?" The man's eyes darted nervously, and his attempts to produce a coherent account only deepened police suspicions. It soon became apparent that his explanation was patchy at best. The officers took him aside for questioning, and after a few terse exchanges, he startled everyone by suddenly attempting to flee. Amid the chaos of shouts and the sudden advance of police, his efforts to escape were swiftly thwarted. Disheveled and exposed by his frantic movements, the man was detained on the spot. While the man was being taken into custody, further investigation began to unravel the tragic mystery surrounding the little girl. Using the description and images quickly disseminated among local law enforcement, authorities recognized her as the missing American child who had been reported stolen in New Jersey a fortnight ago. The confirmation sent shockwaves through the investigators. A case of international abduction was now unfolding, right here in the heart of London. Questions multiplied. How had this child traveled across the Atlantic? Who was the man with her, if he wasn't her guardian or father? Initial checks into the man's identity revealed glaring discrepancies. He could not be linked by any familial bond with the child. His documents were inconsistent and raised red flags, suggesting that he might have been using a false identity to conceal a far more sinister plan. As the police continued their probing, every detail gathered painted an increasingly grim picture of the child's ordeal. The delicate clues, a subtle accent in her soft words, the style of her clothing, and even the tiny pin on her dress, pointed unmistakably to her origins in the United States. In the span of hours, the investigation had shifted gears from a mere disturbance at a royal ceremony to an international crisis involving child abduction, identity fraud, and criminal orchestration. Meanwhile, even as the city buzzed with uncertainty about the unfolding drama, Sergeant Roderick Vale found himself caught in a collision between instinctive duty and bureaucratic consequence. His unsanctioned action, stepping away from his post and breaking the long-standing protocols of the guard in order to rescue a desperate child, had not gone unnoticed by his superiors. In the days that followed, tightly controlled internal communications revealed that Vale was being temporarily suspended, pending a formal inquiry into his actions. In the eyes of the chain of command, his well-intentioned breach of protocol, however noble, was a serious infraction that risked setting a dangerous precedent. Colleagues whispered in the corridors, torn between admiration for his courageous act and anxiety over what his reprimand might mean for the reputation of the Royal Guard. The investigation began in earnest. Senior officers, legal experts, and even ex-military analysts were called in to offer their opinions on whether the rigid observance of ceremonial protocol should yield in the presence of a potential emergency. Simultaneously, news outlets and social media erupted with fervor. The unfolding scandal had transformed into a dramatic narrative of international intrigue. An American child missing for weeks suddenly appeared at the heart of London, rescued or perhaps inadvertently endangered by the decisive act of a solitary sergeant. At Buckingham Palace, the incident disrupted the usual routines, leaving many visitors and staff in stunned disbelief. The combination of breaking news and live updates turned what had been a day marked by tradition and protocol into one defined by deep moral quandaries. People began questioning not only how a child could be abducted across borders, but also the fundamental rigidity of the orders meant to secure the safety of those under royal protection. In the midst of all the unfolding chaos, a pall of uncertainty loomed over the fate of Sergeant Vale. His career, once unassailable and built on a foundation of unwavering discipline, now dangled precariously as officials debated whether his heroic intervention, which had undoubtedly saved a life, would be overshadowed by the breach of centuries-old military protocol. His personal struggle between loyalty to duty as defined by tradition and the overwhelming call of conscience had become an emblem of courage that would soon dominate headlines, along with the dramatic investigation into the child's abduction. In the hours after the commotion at Buckingham Palace, the story began to spiral beyond the carefully arranged framework of tradition and protocol. What started as a singular act of protective instinct now transformed into a sprawling narrative that captured the attention of the world. Journalists, ever vigilant in their pursuit of truth, quickly pieced together the details of the incident. As interviews were conducted with eyewitnesses and footage from the scene circulated online, it became clear that the child with the silent, anguished eyes was none other than the American girl who had been reported missing from New Jersey just 2 weeks prior. Within a short span of time, major news outlets broke the story wide open. Headlines screamed of international abduction, and the startling revelation that the child had been taken from her home country sent shockwaves through both political circles and deeply concerned citizens around the globe. Analysts scrutinized every detail: the way the child had clutched her tiny hand in a covert SOS, the man who had attempted to pass her off as his own, and most notably, the extraordinary intervention by Staff Sergeant Roderick Vale, a man who had risked his spotless career to heed a silent cry for help. As the story spread like wildfire, the internet exploded with a torrent of support and disbelief. Social media platforms buzzed with impassioned discussions, debating the fine line between duty and humanity. Countless posts appeared, praising the sergeant's bravery and condemning the rigid adherence to outdated protocols that too often left vulnerable individuals unprotected. Virtual forums, blogs and news comment sections became a battleground for ideas, with many users insisting that true honor could never be confined by conventional orders. In a climate where opinions could sway public sentiment in an instant, the sergeant's actions resonated deeply with parents, human rights advocates, and citizens who believed that compassion should always supersede bureaucratic formality. Meanwhile, in a twist that underscored the personal stakes of the unfolding drama, the long-lost mother of the missing girl managed to trace her daughter's trail to London. News of her arrival at the palace compounded the unfolding crisis. As she made her way to the area cordoned off by police, her face etched with worry and determination told a story of endless nights spent scouring every clue in a desperate search for her child. The eventual meeting between the mother and the little girl was nothing short of heart-wrenching. In a moment of profound emotion, held back only by the solemn propriety demanded by the royal setting, the mother embraced her daughter. Their reunion was raw and silent, a potent mix of tearful relief and the lingering scars of fear and terror from a recent past. Onlookers, including seasoned journalists and compassionate bystanders, stood transfixed in the background as this tender scene unfolded, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the darkest of times. But amid the overwhelming public support and the flood of accolades for his intervention, Sergeant Roderick Vale found himself ensnared in a personal storm of uncertainty. In the quiet moments after the immediate crisis, he wrestled with the disquieting question: was this act of defiant compassion worth the potential ruin of a career built on a foundation of indomitable discipline? The weight of tradition pressed upon him, and whispers about his breach of protocol spread through the ranks even as praise for his decisive heroism grew louder outside. His superiors had already initiated internal proceedings to determine the proper response to his unsanctioned intervention. The strict chain of command, which had always been the backbone of the ceremonial guard, could not overlook the fact that by stepping away from his post, he had disrupted a centuries-old ritual, even if his action had undoubtedly saved a life. Soon enough, Sergeant Vale received formal notice, summoning him to a high-level hearing at his regimental headquarters. The letter, terse and devoid of emotion, outlined the need for a detailed account of his actions that morning. Within its words lay a silent warning that regardless of his heroic gesture, he would have to face the consequences of deviating from prescribed orders. The prospect of a disciplinary hearing, one that could potentially end a career marked by impeccable service, filled him with a growing melancholy. As he prepared himself for what would likely be an arduous debate over duty versus conscience, his mind churned with memories of the oath he had taken so many years ago. He recalled the countless hours spent perfecting the ritual of his service, the unspoken understanding that every instruction was given not just to maintain order, but to honor a legacy. Yet in that fateful moment, his convictions had carried him further than he had ever imagined. News outlets began to focus on this internal conflict. Analysts pondered the ethical dimensions of his decision. Could a system that penalizes an act of salvific humanity truly be called just? Editorials emerged arguing that if rigid adherence to protocol prevented one from saving even a single innocent life, then perhaps the system itself required reform. Public petitions and letters flooded the official channels, with citizens from across the nation urging the authorities to recognize that, in extraordinary circumstances, the moral imperative to protect can and should supersede even the most time-honored procedures. In the midst of such passionate debate, the sergeant's upcoming hearing loomed large. His colleagues, though initially divided on the issue, began to rally around him in a cautious show of solidarity. Brief, whispered conversations in the corridors of the palace hinted at a growing consensus that his actions, brave and necessary as they were, deserved recognition rather than reprimand. Yet the final decision rested with the chain of command, a system steeped in tradition and unswerving discipline. As the day wore on and preparations were set for his formal hearing, Sergeant Roderick Vale remained alone with his thoughts. He pondered the profound paradox of his situation. The very gestures that defined his steadfast commitment to duty had now placed him on the precipice of a career-ending reckoning. With his thoughts a swirling mix of determination, regret, and cautious hope, he prepared to face his superiors, knowing deeply that his single act of compassion might irrevocably change the way not only his career, but the entire system that governed royal security was perceived. In a stark, sterile hearing room far removed from the grandeur of Buckingham Palace's ceremonial lawns, Staff Sergeant Roderick Vale found himself standing before a stern panel of high-ranking officials. The walls, adorned with polished wood paneling and muted portraits of legendary guardians past, now bore witness to a moment of intense internal reckoning, a moment where duty and humanity collided head-on. The air was heavy with the dual weight of tradition and impending judgment, as Vale prepared to explain the decisions that had rocked centuries of unyielding protocol. At the front of the room, a high command council, including senior officers and representatives from the Royal Guard's administrative arm, fixed their eyes upon him. Their faces were etched with a measured seriousness, as they reviewed every minute detail of the events that had disrupted the revered ceremony. Vale, though visibly tense under their collective scrutiny, maintained a composed posture that betrayed his unshaken conviction. In a voice that resonated with both humility and quiet defiance, he began his testimony. "I recognize the sanctity of our traditions," he stated firmly, "and understand that every rule in our service is designed to maintain order and preserve the dignity of our institution. Yet I must also say that there comes a time when the higher call of honor and the undeniable duty to protect life demands actions that might, by all appearances, break with convention." Eyes in the room narrowed, and a heavy silence ensued, punctuated only by the soft rustle of papers. He paused, then continued, "I firmly believe that it is better to breach protocol than to allow an innocent life to slip away unnoticed." A murmur rippled through the panel. Some faces in the room reflected admiration for his candor, while others bore the cold mask of bureaucratic disapproval. His next words, chosen not for rhetorical flourish, but for their raw sincerity, sent a clear message. "Had I hesitated even for a moment, I would have risked leaving that child in a situation far more perilous than any reprimand I might face. In that moment, my conscience and the silent, desperate gesture I witnessed compelled me to act." The room seemed to hold its breath. It was not every day that a decorated member of the Royal Guard openly challenged centuries of tradition in the name of human decency. As Vale's statement echoed in the confined space, the panel's conflicted expressions grew more pronounced. Some of the senior officers, hardened by years of unwavering adherence to protocol, exchanged discreet glances, as if weighing the gravity of his words against the long-established principles they had all been sworn to uphold. Yet even among them there flickered a trace of understanding, a recognition that in exceptional circumstances, rigid formality might prove a brittle shield against real human suffering. Outside the closed doors of that hearing room, the story had already ignited a firestorm of public debate. Media outlets, having picked up on the sergeant's brave act and subsequent summoning, broadcast the unfolding drama to an audience hungry for stories of genuine courage. Editorials decried the potential for a system too fixated on procedure to overlook the cry of a distressed child, while citizens from around the globe signed petitions demanding that the man who had saved a life be honored, not punished. The support was overwhelming. Parents, human rights advocates, and people of all stripes echoed Vale's sentiment in impassioned letters and social media posts. "Honor must come before protocol," they declared, insisting that true duty is measured not by the blind adherence to orders, but by the willingness to make hard choices when the stakes involve potential loss of life. The public outcry reached even the more remote corridors of royal administration, forcing those in charge to confront the mounting pressure for an equitable resolution. As the hearing progressed, the debate within the panel grew heated. Some officers argued that Vale's actions, though well-intentioned, undermined the very order that had safeguarded the institution for centuries. Others, however, spoke up in measured tones about the unforeseen nature of emergencies and the moral imperative to act when innocence was threatened. One influential voice from the council ultimately remarked, "While our procedures exist for a reason, they must not become an immutable barrier that prevents us from doing what is just when faced with an unequivocal plea for aid." His colleagues hesitated before nodding reluctantly, a silent concession that perhaps in this rare instance, the system's rigidity might indeed need a compassionate exception. As the formal session drew to a close, the officers announced that the decision regarding disciplinary action would be delayed pending further review of the extraordinary circumstances. Preliminary indications were that Sergeant Roderick Vale's future in service would be decided not solely by the infraction he had committed, but by the overwhelming public sentiment and moral clarity his actions had invoked. In break rooms and hushed corridors across the palace and the headquarters, whispers rose and fell. A growing number of his peers recognized that his choice to break the rules in the face of imminent danger was not a failure of discipline, but a triumph of humane valor. When a representative from the Royal Guard's High Command eventually spoke on the matter in a measured press conference, his words carried the weight of both authority and reluctant admiration. Let it be known that the honor of our service is not measured by unyielding conformity to protocol alone, but by the courage to make decisions that protect the vulnerable. Today, we acknowledge that true dignity is found in choosing compassion over cold formality. In that moment of reckoning, Sergeant Vale's defiant stand had transformed from a potential career-ending breach of protocol into a clarion call for institutional change. The message was unmistakable. In the face of crisis, the human heart must guide the hand that serves. And while the debate within the echelons of command was far from over, a growing chorus, both inside and out, affirmed that sometimes the highest honor lies in following one's conscience, even if it means daring to break the rules. In the weeks that followed the explosive investigation and heated internal debates, the corridors of both Buckingham Palace and the headquarters of the Royal Guard buzzed with a transformation that few had dared to imagine. What began as a dramatic rupture in a centuries-old ceremonial routine had evolved into a watershed moment in which the timeless principles of duty, humanity, and conscience were re-examined and ultimately redefined. The investigation into the abduction had gathered momentum on an international scale. As the inquiry unfolded, the truth became unmistakable. The little American girl, whose silent SOS had pierced the calm of the palace grounds, was indeed the victim of a meticulously planned international kidnapping. The detained man, whose identity had been shrouded in deceit and false documents, was unmasked as part of a larger criminal network, with operatives spanning multiple borders. His attempts to pass off the child as his own were quickly discredited by forensic evidence and digital footprints linking him to a pattern of child trafficking that had haunted law enforcement agencies long before he set foot in London. Amidst this legal and criminal unraveling, the fate of Staff Sergeant Roderick Vale hung in the balance. His unsanctioned intervention, an act that had risked his illustrious career, was now being re-evaluated in light of the profound consequences his quick thinking had secured. Initially, the chain of command had condemned his breach of protocol, warning that strict adherence to tradition was the very bedrock of the Guard's honor. But as the investigation laid bare the stark reality of the child's peril, public opinion and internal reviews began to shift. The sergeant's act was lauded, not as an act of reckless disobedience, but as a defining moment of compassionate heroism. Within the hallowed chambers of the Royal Guard's administrative office, a series of emergency meetings were convened. Legal experts, high-ranking officers, and even members of the Palace Advisory Council argued fervently that no rigid regulation should stand between an officer and an innocent life in desperate distress. After examining the entirety of the evidence, from the unmistakable SOS gesture of the child to the subsequent rescue operation that thwarted the abductor's plans, a unanimous, if hesitant, conclusion emerged. Staff Sergeant Vale's actions, though technically against protocol, had saved a life, and in doing so, had upheld the inviolate spirit of duty. In a public ceremony held in a modest yet emotionally charged setting near Buckingham Palace, officials announced that Sergeant Roderick Vale would be fully reinstated to his. More significantly, as a symbol of their acknowledgement of his heroism and moral courage, he was awarded a Distinguished Medal of Valor by a joint delegation from the British authorities and a representative of the United States government. The medal, resplendent and bearing engravings of both nations' emblems, signified a cross-border recognition that true duty transcends bureaucratic rigidity and that the protection of the vulnerable is a universal imperative. In his address following the reinstatement, Sergeant Vale stood at a podium overlooking a crowd of fellow officers, dignitaries, and members of the press. His voice, steady and resolute despite the weight of recent events, carried an aura of both humility and defiance as he spoke to his colleagues and to a nation watching with fevered intensity. This is not about personal glory, nor is it about defying orders for the sake of defiance. he declared. It is about the unwavering commitment to protect those who cannot protect themselves. It is about having the courage to listen with your heart when a silent plea for help beckons you, even if it means taking risks that might shatter years of unyielding conformity. He paused, his gaze sweeping over faces that reflected admiration, relief, and a touch of awe. I stand before you today not as a hero clothed in accolades, but as a humble servant of duty who believes that true strength is measured by the willingness to break the bounds of tradition when life itself is on the line. Let my actions remind you that sometimes the highest form of loyalty to our cherished values is not blind adherence to protocol, but the discernment to act from the depths of our conscience. His final words, spoken softly yet resolutely, reverberated like a clarion call through the solemn hall. It is not about heroism, it is about looking through the eyes of your heart and choosing humanity even when the rules say otherwise. The audience erupted in applause, a heartfelt, unrestrained outpouring that united military tradition with human compassion. For many, this moment marked the beginning of a new era in which the rigid boundaries of protocol would be challenged by a renewed commitment to justice and empathy. Even as some of the older custodians of tradition exchanged wary glances, they could not deny that the events had brought to light an essential truth, that when hearts are led by conscience, traditions can evolve and systems can be remade in the light of humane understanding. In the final scene, as dusk settled softly over the palace grounds and the day's turbulent events began to wind down, Sergeant Vale returned to his post. His stance at attention was as impeccable as ever, yet now there was an unmistakable spark in his eyes, a spark of quiet pride intertwined with the wisdom of a man who had stared danger in the face and chosen to act. Tourists no longer saw him merely as another guard in a sea of uniforms. They saw him as a guardian whose actions transcended duty and defined true honor. In that enduring moment, as the palace's ancient stones bore silent witness and the ceremonial guards resumed their guarded vigil, one message shone clearly through the tapestry of events. A true hero is one who dares to defy orders when those orders stand between an innocent cry and the promise of salvation. A true hero is the one who dares break the command for the sake of saving the innocent. Subscribe if you believe that deep courage is found in choosing compassion over convention, and share your thoughts in the comments. Would you act on a silent plea for help, even at the risk of everything?